Welcome to the St. Thomas More Lynchburg's Homily Podcast. We join Father John Christian as he brings his insight and application to the readings for the 22nd Sunday in Ordinary Time.
Throughout the Gospels, our Lord often levies his harshest criticism at the scribes and Pharisees. We hear that when he quotes Isaiah to them, identifying them as the hypocrites that they are. And we hear throughout the Gospels, the scribes and Pharisees often taking issue with Jesus. And it's interesting to see that these learned elite, these experts in the Mosaic law and all of the accretions and observations that had kind of come up with it and around it, it had gotten to the point where they, as the learned ones who wrote and read these things, could more or less basically lord it over the rest of the population who could neither read nor interpret all that was written. In point of fact, it was as if divine law and human positive law were becoming indistinguishable. And so we look at their reaction to Jesus throughout the scriptures. They began to move and plot against him. These men who had set themselves up as the experts in all things relating to the divine and salvation and what is proper observance and what isn't. But Jesus calls them out and sees them for what they are, sees that it's all superficial and just vainglorious spiritual exhibitionism. It's all self-serving and utterly devoid. And it becomes utterly inscrutable to the people that presumably they ought to be leading and teaching. And so when we look at their reaction to Jesus, it's kind of what is it about him that they so take issue with? And it's really very interesting because it's very telling. They take issue with his mercy. The mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ offends their sensibilities. For in their self-assuredness, they think that they know the way to heaven by doing all of these extra little steps and ritual observances that are more or less human invention, that is the way and that in itself is sufficient. In other words, they've convinced themselves that they are the righteous ones and that they are the only ones that will get to heaven, or rather, the only ones that will be worthy of God anyway. And so, of course, when Jesus comes and shares his message of mercy, that just annihilates that belief, because what Jesus' mercy reminds us is that salvation and union with God are things that come from him. They're not things that we can just do on our own. We cannot save ourselves. We cannot, through various observances, make ourselves worthy. It doesn't work like that. And so Jesus' message of mercy undermined all of these things that the scribes and Pharisees had come to so value. And in essence, reminding them, you cannot save yourself, And so Jesus then, as he confronts the hypocrites, calls us to a deeper understanding of our relationship with him. He calls us to trust in him. And one of the ways we can go about that is by fostering and cultivating the very spiritual integrity that was lacking in the scribes and Pharisees. For all of their outward show, they were inwardly dead. And so our Lord Jesus Christ calls us to not be like that, but for our internal life to correspond to what we profess and confess and assent and attest to. That what we do in here within the church and within sight of each other needs to correspond to who we are and how we are. We're called to have that integrity of life, and that none of our religious observance be mere vainglorious acting and demonstration. And if we can bring ourselves to that through the grace of God and allowing his grace to act in our lives, that we might be who we're called to be and made to be, it's then that we can come to that fuller trust in him. For our Lord Jesus reminds us that it's those things that come from within that defile a person, not these outside aspects, but rather those evil thoughts that Jesus and that list at the end of the gospel passage talks about: the folly, the pride, the arrogance, adultery, licentiousness, all of these things that come from within us as sinful beings. But again, Christ's mercy puts that into its proper perspective. For if we have that spiritual integrity whereby we recognize and understand and see these shortcomings in ourselves, we know that we can avail ourselves of his mercy. Our Lord Jesus Christ, his mission of mercy to us is one that is continued within his church. All of his teaching has been handed down to us through the ages, through his church. We look to how our Lord Jesus Christ gave the power of the keys to his church, the power to loose and bind on earth and in heaven. And we practice that through the sacrament of penance or confession or reconciliation. There is no thing that is so great that we can't be forgiven it. The only unforgivable sin is the unconfessed sin. For if we ourselves don't recognize it as such, lacking spiritual integrity, then how can we confess it? And if we don't confess it, we can't be absolved of it. And so we as Christians never want to presume. We want to preserve that spiritual integrity, recognize those things that do indeed defile us, and bring them to our Lord Jesus Christ's mercy. We want to live in integrity and we want to live in mercy. We want to receive the grace that he offers us. And so one of the best ways, of course, again, is to recognize that which has defiled and to bring it in trust to our Lord Jesus Christ's mercy. For in calling us to his mercy, he calls us to trust in him. And trust in him is, again, another way of having faith in him. And so our Lord Jesus Christ reminds us that we cannot trust in ourselves. We cannot assure ourselves of salvation. We cannot just give ourselves grace or make ourselves more grace-filled. We have to turn to him. We have to come to him, and we have to trust in him and in his mercy.
Thank you for tuning in to the St. Thomas More Lynchburg's Homily Podcast. For the daily reading and to learn more about the community of St. Thomas More, please visit our website at www.stmva.org. If you were blessed by our podcast today, please give it a like, a kind review, and share it with a friend. God bless.